Here. Okay, so this is probably one of the lectures that I give that's the closest, kind of the most near and dear to my heart. Okay, as somebody that has an anxiety disorder and sort of has kind of dealt with that for most of my adult life, but spent about half of it not realizing that I had one. I think that it's really, really important for us to talk about these things and to kind of share the actual prevalence of anxiety disorders and anxiety, depression and depressive symptoms and things, and then how there are lots of different ways that we can use exercise or physical activity as potential ways to kind of combat a little bit of that. Okay, so this is probably something. How many of you guys have had a general psych class? Does everybody, you guys all have to have general psych? I think so. Liz nods yes, but then was not like, no, I've had psych. But yeah, so hopefully some of this stuff is not going to come like completely out of left field for you guys. You're going to have some level of appreciation for kind of what this is. Okay, so to start off with, we need to talk about how we assess the psychology of what you're feeling. Okay, how do we know, right? Like, how do we know what's going on? How do we know if Leah's feeling good or bad or happy or sad or mad or whatever it's going to be? And then based upon that, how might we compare her to Nick, okay? And compare Nick to Macy, okay? And so the way that we do this is a little bit more difficult than, let's just say we're going to hand you some weights and say we're going to keep giving you more and more weight until you can't lift it anymore. Or that we're going to put you on the treadmill and we're going to see how far you can run and use that to estimate your VO2 max or something. This is a little bit more of an ethereal kind of concept, all right? So to understand all of that, how do we assess what a psychological state is going to be, okay? So we have to ask people. You have to tell us, okay? That makes these things what we call self-reported, okay? I can, and this is, we won't do it in this class, I can potentially measure some physiological variables to tell, like if you're anxious, potentially. I could measure your heart rate. I could potentially measure something called the galvanic skin response. I could measure the dilation of your pupils or something. Galvanic skin response is like imperceptible sweating and things, or maybe a little bit of things that we can do there. But in general, I just have to ask you, okay? To say, Sarah, how are you feeling today? And I have to trust that you're going to be honest with me, right? I have to trust that when you filled out your questionnaires for today, that you were being honest, that you weren't trying to kind of game what those things are to give me or yourself some kind of response. So they're self-reported. The other issue with these things is that they are subjective, okay? They are subjective. And that simply means that how you experience something may be both quantitatively and qualitatively different than somebody else, okay? So in this way, moods and feelings and things are in the eye of the beholder, right? Taylor may say, I am at a 5 out of 10 on how anxious I am today, okay? And that may in no way, shape, or form, if we can measure how anxious she is, that may have nothing to do with, say, how anxious Hannah is, even if Hannah says she's also at a 5 out of 10. Those may be very different kinds of things, right? Based upon their history of being anxious about something and a host of other stuff, okay? So it's somewhat difficult for us to make really, really direct comparisons among people. So just keep that in mind as we go through. The other thing that we need to know in order to try to assess these things is how transitory or permanent are your feelings? Is this particular state, okay? You're anxious now because you have a test at 1 o'clock, and as soon as the test is over, you are no longer going to be anxious, right? Or you're like me, and it's just, I am anxious because I am just anxious, right? It's just kind of an all the time sort of thing that goes on, right? Or I am happy because I'm just happy. Or you know what, I'm happy because this morning I got a puppy, or whatever. Maybe I would be sad because I'm not at home with the puppy. It just kind of depends, all right? So we need to ask questions then as part of our self-report to understand things on, is what you are feeling permanent or transitory? And then we also need to understand what is the intensity of all of that, okay? So we have to ask you about the magnitude. And sometimes that's tricky because we need to give you something against which to anchor, okay? So, am I worried? Well, maybe, but think of the most worried you've ever been and then rate it based upon like how close to that am I or something, okay? So we need to kind of understand what these things really are. So we can measure a psychological state, and that's indeed what we did with those questionnaires that I gave, okay? And we're asking about how do you feel right now, or how do you feel in general, and it's asking what's the intensity of this particular feeling at that particular point in time, okay? Something else to appreciate, okay? We need to make distinctions between this idea of a mood and an emotion, okay? Moods are sustained feelings, things that may last for minutes, but very often may kind of occur over a much longer period of time, okay? Days, weeks, months, in that way. You guys may not think about it like that. You may think, oh, I'm in a mood. It's going to last for a couple of hours, or it's going to last for a couple of days, or whatever else. But moods can last much longer than that, okay? Emotions, at least in the way we're going to define them for our class and for our purposes, are much more shorter term, okay? They're much shorter term. Chandler whacks Megan in the back of the head with something, right? Don't please do this. But then Megan gets mad. That's an emotion. Like, I am now, right? I'm upset because you hit me in the back of the head. And then in a half an hour, I'm going to be fine. We're going to all move on with our lives, okay? That's the difference. So to really understand things, we need to try to get at these ideas of moods, okay? So anxiety, depression, right? Those are going to be what we would call a mood disorder. These are going to be longer term kind of feelings and psychological states that are going to be either negative or some kind of a departure from what we might call kind of normal or sort of baseline. Okay? So they tend to be very negative. So when we assess things, like you guys have already done, we can ask very general terms, okay, or we can ask very specific kinds of terms. And generally, when we do this, we present them on a spectrum, okay? So I can ask about a general mood. Are you in a pleasant mood or an unpleasant mood? And I give you either end to anchor our question, okay? Think about the most unpleasant mood you've ever been in, the most unpleasant you've ever felt, and then the most pleasant. Where are you between those two kinds of things? That's really, really important. Because moods and psychological states tend to be subjective, we have to give really, really precise definitions to people, okay? So that we can know and hope that everybody's going to try to do this in roughly the same manner. We can give specific things. So it's not just, are you in a pleasant or an unpleasant mood or state, but are you depressed? With depressed on one end versus happy on the other end. Or are you anxious or are you calm? And so we can be very, very specific about every one of these kinds of things, which is what we did with those questionnaires. Are you angry or not? Are you happy or are you sad? So we can kind of put these things on this kind of spectrum. Okay? Does that make sense? You guys kind of understand all of that, right? And then we can say, okay, somewhere between these two things, right? I feel calm, right? I feel a little bit calm. I feel a lot calm. I feel really, really calm. I feel like, Basset Hound chill kind of calm, and something like all of that, okay? Okay, so the one questionnaire that I gave you guys that we're going to come back to at the very end is one, the profile of mood states is one that allows us to assess multiple dimensions, okay? There were 30 questions, and there were 5 questions each for 6 different mood dimensions, okay? There are questions that are going to ask you about anxiety, depression, anger, confusion, fatigue, and then what we're going to consider in some ways almost the opposite of fatigue, which is vigor. Okay? So, pardon? Okay. Your computer talks to you, Sandra? Is it like Alexa or something? No. Kind of. Okay. So, returning back to this, of these 6 dimensions of the profile of mood states, 5 are negative. 5 are what we consider negative moods. Vigor is considered a positive mood. Okay? Vigor is, think of vigor as energy. Okay? You think of like vigorous intensity exercise. Vigor means like I'm full of pep and I'm really kind of raring to go today. Okay? Some people want to put vigor as the kind of opposite of fatigue, right? I'm tired, I'm sleepy, or something like that. For our purposes, they're 2 different things, okay? You could have a lot of vigor, but also be very fatigued, if that makes any kind of sense. You guys probably have a friend or a family member or somebody that is like that, and they just always seem to have all of this energy, even if like they haven't slept for 3 days and things are crazy. Okay, so when we score these things, it's sort of what is the intensity of this, and you give us a rating from 0 to 4. And then we add all of the negative ones up, we can subtract out the positive ones, and we can figure out how much mood disturbance do you have. So what we will see later on, okay, is that we can use certain of these dimensions. Some of them are positively or negatively impacted by being more active, by exercising. And then sometimes if I exercise too much, then they may be impacted in an opposite direction. Some of them are going to have positive effects, some of them are going to have negative. And so we can use your scores on this in order to try to assess, should you actually go for a hard run today or should you take it easy today? And indeed, this is something that is, in fact, used by, like the Thunder use a deal like this. It has been used in some other Olympic sports and things to try to kind of get at how are people feeling today, and can we figure out what you should do in practice based upon it. Okay. Okay. We're going to come back to that. That's kind of how we assess things. So what we're going to start with, though, is we're going to start talking about anxiety. Okay. So this is one where I have a lot of personal experience on. And so what we would say is that anxiety is the most common form of psychological or emotional disturbance or illness in the U.S. Okay? So about 18, or it's almost 20% of adults will develop an anxiety disorder that warrants treatment. Okay? If we look, okay, and kind of break those things down demographically, if 20% of adults develop these kinds of things, we were to dig into all of that. College aged, okay, or sort of 18 to 25-year-old white women are the single most anxious group of people that we come across. Okay, so for the most part, ladies, I'm sorry. Maybe it's our fault as guys, or in society. There's a whole bunch of them, but you guys tend to be the most anxious group. Okay, there does seem to be a bit of gender bias in all of this that we think is not real. Okay, we think a lot of it has to do with men being unwilling to admit and report that they are anxious. Okay, we also think that that may be a little bit of what happens from an ethnicity standpoint as well. That there may be a little bit more stigma in some of the ethnic minority populations versus sort of people of Caucasian descent. We don't know that for sure, but that kind of is going to be what's going on. Okay. So there's about $45 billion in healthcare costs associated with anxiety disorders and lost work due to anxiety. Okay? So we don't have to have any shows of hands, but I just want you guys to think about this. The statistics tell us, right, that somewhere between 20 and 25% of you guys in class are likely to have an anxiety. So like 1 in 4 of you. Okay, because you're college age, we tend to have a lot of women. Okay, so about 1 in 4 of you guys may have an anxiety disorder. Think if any of you have ever not done something because you're so anxious. Okay, I didn't get out of bed and go to class today, or I didn't go to that particular social event because of whatever today, or I couldn't go to my job today because that's what I was really anxious. I was worried about something. So factored into this $1 billion in cost are things like that. Lost work productivity. Okay? It's not just I pay $25 every time that I go to see my therapist, and then my insurance pays the rest, or I pay $15 a month for my medication that I take, or whatever that's going to be. So factored in the midst of all of this is the fact that sometimes anxiety is going to alter behavior in a way that we're going to lose work productivity. Okay? It's about 60% more common in women than men, like I said, more common in Caucasians and other ethnic groups. We're trying to tease some of this out as to whether or not there is something unique about women and Caucasian women especially, or if it's just underreporting in the other groups. Okay? All right. So what is anxiety? All right. Well, anxiety is worry. It's most basic. It's just worry. Okay? Doesn't matter what it is that you're worried about. It's just worrying about something. Okay? So apprehension, worry, and we sometimes also call it tension. In the profile of mood states, it's not called anxiety, it's called tension. But think of tension in this way. I'm worried about something and my muscles are tense, okay? Or my jaw is tense, or I'm grinding my teeth or something, okay? Anxiety is not exactly fear, okay? So although phobias are types of anxiety disorders, you're worried about something, and it's not necessarily because you are perfectly fearful of that. The anxiety tends to be longer and often occurs without an obvious external stimulus, right? If you are afraid of spiders, and I put a big ass spider right in front of you, you would say that you're anxious. You're worried about that spider, but if I take the spider away, then maybe it goes back down, okay? So it's worrying about something, oftentimes about things that we don't have any control over, oftentimes things that you think there's an external stimulus. I'm worried about getting into grad school, okay? But grad school may be 18 months away, okay? I'm worried about getting a job. That may be 6 months away or whatever. I'm worried about, well, what happens if this. You may think those are obvious external stimuli, but sometimes they're not, okay? I had a job, I lost the job, I can't pay my rent this month. That's an obvious external stimulus. The thought of some future thing that may or may not happen is not really what we're going to consider an external stimulus in this instance, okay? Oftentimes, anxiety can be combined with changes in the autonomic nervous system, okay? Fight or flight response. So increases in heart rate, increases in blood pressure, okay? Increases in cardiac output, flushing of the skin, right? So it's these things that they're gonna look like all of that. So as you will see in a couple of slides, there are what we call cognitive and somatic symptoms of anxiety. Cognitive are thought process things, right? Here's what I'm thinking about when I'm worried. Somatic symptoms are body related. If you were to look at these things, you can measure that my heart rate has gone up. You can measure that my core body temperature has increased. You can measure that I'm shivering or shaking or something along those lines. Okay? We've already talked some about this idea of state versus trait. Okay? So state anxiety is I am presently worrying about something. Trait anxiety is, at its most basic, I am generally worried about something all the time. Okay? Oftentimes, state is going to shift. I'm worried about a test. I'm worried about what's going to happen at Thanksgiving because my family's going to fight over something, right? I'm worried about, I don't know, breaking up with my boyfriend, whatever that might be, okay? So, whereas trait is just generally I worry, okay? That's me. I have plenty of things that I worry about from a state standpoint, but just in general, I worry, okay? What causes this? Why do we worry? And the general answer is we have no damn idea. Okay, we got no clue. Is it an imbalance of neurotransmitters in the brain? Does it have to do with serotonin and dopamine and GABA and those things? Probably. Okay. Is it how the brain sort of processes and kind of cognitively thinks about things? Sure. Okay. Is it environmental? Maybe. Is it genetic? Probably. Okay. My mom worries. I worry. Her mom worried. That's why she worried. So we all worry, right? Am I terrified that my daughter's going to have an anxiety disorder because I do? Absolutely I am, right? Are there other things that we can't really figure out? Yes, okay? Because this is in some ways this cognitive issue. You can't see into and test your brain super easily. There's not always an obvious external thing to deal with. It's hard for us to measure and understand. So is there some part of all of these things working together? And the answer is probably yes. Okay? Probably yes. Okay. So there are multiple kinds of anxiety disorders. The most common is something called generalized anxiety disorder. This is the one that I have. And it's sometimes just called GAD. And that means you just worry. Okay? You worry about everything. If I'm not worried about something, I'll worry about the fact that I'm not worried about something. As my dad says, my mom will just invent something to worry about. It doesn't really matter. Solve the problem that she has, and then she'll just move on and worry about something else. It's just kind of how we operate. Okay? These are the most common. Phobias are a type of anxiety disorder, but they have some obvious kind of thing that you worry about. I'm afraid of spiders. I'm afraid of speaking in public, right? Something like that. Panic disorders are going to be a kind of anxiety disorder. Although you can, to be honest, you can have all of these other ones and sometimes have what we would call a panic attack, which is a very, very sort of acute increase in a lot of the, especially the somatic symptoms that we see with things. So I had sort of one of my probably most sort of powerful panic attacks ever a couple of weeks ago when the power was all out. When we were with my daughter in our hotel room, and I basically had a total and complete meltdown with things. And so, these things can kind of come and go with your other stuff. Obsessive compulsive disorder is a form of anxiety disorder. A lot of times you will see people that have GAD that are going to have obsessive thoughts, like you're always thinking about something. You're always thinking about the same thing. How do I deal with this? How do I deal with that? How do I deal with this? Okay. And then, so obsessive means thinking about it a bunch, and then compulsive, you feel like compulsion to do something, say something, engage in a particular kind of activity. Like, right, I have a friend that he doesn't really have kind of particularly kind of bad obsessive compulsive disorder, but he vacuums his carpet 4 times a day. Anytime, and he wants to see when you vacuum, he wants to be able to see the vacuum marks, like the suction marks on the carpet. And so then somebody walks by and kind of messes those things up, and he wants to get the vacuum out and vacuum it like again, right? He's like, it's clean and it's orderly, and it's clean and it's orderly, and those things. And so he thinks about that a lot. That's the obsessive part, and then he feels compelled to come back and rearrange it in the way that it was before. Okay, so OCD can occur in kind of very mild forms to very, very severe forms, and it exists on the spectrum. Okay, and then post-traumatic stress is also going to be a form of an anxiety disorder. Okay, we're learning more and more about post-traumatic stress. It's become a much, much bigger thing, especially with, this is not just with people that say are soldiers that are coming back from being in combat or something like that, but you can get post-traumatic stress from anything, from a car accident, from, say, a loved one passing away, or kind of some sort of abuse situation. So you can get post-traumatic stress in response to a whole bunch of things. Those are kind of the most common forms of anxiety disorder. Okay. Questions about that? We okay? Yes. Okay. So we're going to talk just a little bit more depth about generalized anxiety disorder just because that's the one where a lot of the research on physical activity and exercising has been done, is on people with generalized anxiety disorder. Okay? Can we use exercise for panic attacks and phobias and those things? Maybe, but the most positive outcomes seem to be with generalized anxiety disorder. So what you see here in front of you, okay, these are the definitions from the Diagnostic Services Manual, something called the DSM, okay? And this is the thing that doctors or psychiatrists or psychologists, this is the book that they use to try to diagnose somebody specifically as having a particular emotional illness. Okay? So I borrowed this directly from, I think this is from the 6th version. My wife's college roommate is a clinical psychologist, and so I got Kat to send this to me. So here's what we have. If you have generalized anxiety disorder, you tend to have unrealistic or excessive worry about 2 or more life circumstances for at least 6 months. Okay? I don't want anybody to freak out. I don't want anybody, if you're a worrier, to worry anymore, but just think about, have I been worrying about 2 or more things in my life, okay, for 6 months or longer? Okay? So think about that. You have some level of difficulty, and this one is difficult to define, right? Difficulty controlling or coping with that anxiety and worry. What does that difficulty look like? I don't know. It's going to vary from person to person, okay? The source of anxiety is not due to panic, social phobia, obsessive compulsion, or weight gain, okay? There's not, in some ways, some particular kind of external thing or circumstantial thing that goes on there. And it is then the presence on most days over the previous 6 months of some of the following symptoms: tense, wound up, or restless. Weirdly, then also easily fatigued. Okay? Trouble concentrating, irritability, tensions in your muscles, and difficulty sleeping. Okay, this is the one, and kind of these top 2 and the bottom one are the ones that all tend to cluster together, right? I feel tense, I feel wound up, I feel restless, therefore I have a hard time sleeping, and then because of all of that, I am then easily fatigued. Okay? So I have trouble concentrating because you very often tend to come back to these other things that you're worrying about. So if you have all of these, or some combination of these things, then there's a reasonable chance that you may have generalized anxiety disorder. Okay? When we look at this, okay, one of the things that we can do to try to understand what's going on is we can look at both the cognitive dimensions of things, so how are you thinking about things about what you're worrying, and then the somatic. So the cognitive ones, these are the things that we assessed on the state trait anxiety index. Things like, do you feel calm? Do you feel tense? Do you feel nervous or relaxed? I am presently worrying over possible misfortunes, whatever that might be. Okay? It's misfortune roulette. Pick whatever it is that you think is going to be not so great. So this is a thinking side of things. That's what the cognitive stands for. And I didn't give you guys one, but we could. There is a somatic scale, or something called the body awareness scale, where we see, like, my heart is pounding. My mouth is dry, my hands are shaking, my vision is blurred, I may feel cold, right? These are going to be actual physical symptoms that we can see. Very often, people that have lots of anxiety are going to have both of these things. These things tend to track and go together. Okay? Okay. So, we're going to do one thing here, then we'll take a little bit of a break. So everybody pull up your SCI score. Okay? Pull those things out. Let's see if I've got a write mine down from this morning for you guys. Okay. So weirdly, I'm having a pretty calm day. So my state was 37. My trait today was 68. Okay. Today my state was 37. My trait was 68. Now, just look at your numbers, okay? What I'm going to tell you guys is that we can use, and it is often used, we can use the trait portion of the index to be diagnostic for whether or not you have generalized anxiety disorder. So, on the trait side, if your trait value was greater than 44 or 45, then there's a very reasonable chance, like we can look at the things, it's like a, there's about a 3/4 chance, about a 75% chance that you have generalized anxiety disorder, okay? Over 45. So 45 is 44, 45, it kind of varies from year to year on those things. I'm at 68. The max score is 80, okay? The max is 80. When I did this in the summer, my trait was at like 73. My trait tends to go somewhere from the very high 60s to the very low 70s. Okay? It's a little lower today because I'm having a pretty good state kind of day. Right? So I'm not really worried about much today. That can change at any moment, right? The phone goes off, who knows? You get a CNN update on my phone and I freak the hell out. Okay? That's kind of where we are. Okay? That's where we are. All right. So look at those things. And you may have some kind of incongruence with this. You may have very high state today, but very low trait in general. That is okay. All right? Just think about kind of how that is and kind of think about what's going on with yourself. Okay? All right. Let's take a 7-minute break. So we'll come back at 11:55. Okay? And that will be, and we'll start talking a little bit about the effects of exercise on anxiety, and then we'll get into depression. Turn the recording back on. So now that I've worried those of you that are worriers, let's talk about what we can do from an exercise and a physical activity standpoint to try to combat some of our anxiety. Okay. So there's been a lot of research that has been done throughout the years on the effects of exercise, acutely and chronically, on feelings of anxiety. And so what we need to consider as we work our way through all of this is that there may be somewhat different effects on state and trait anxiety, okay? So if you are anxious right now, regardless of what's going on, and you go on exercise, that may do one thing. And then it may have some other effects on trait anxiety. Those may not always be the same. Does the sample, so do the people that we are doing our research on, do they have an anxiety disorder? Okay, we'll get into a little bit of that in a minute. When are we measuring anxiety? Are we measuring it during exercise? Are we measuring it right after exercise? Are we measuring it an hour or 2 hours after exercise? Because all of those things may give us somewhat different results. And then how many times? Okay, are we going to measure it out for a couple of days, for a couple of weeks, or how many times are we going to be kind of looking at all of this? Okay. Okay. So here are these are some relatively old data, but what I'm hoping that they will do is give you just kind of a little bit of a brief idea on these things. Okay. So what you see here is this is state trait anxiety index measured. Okay. And this is state anxiety. So it's how do you feel right now? We have a group in blue here that were our control subjects that we just simply measured what's your normal amount, where are you before we were going to have you do something, and then kind of over the course of several hours. And so our control group did nothing. They came in, they sat down, and we had them fill this out every half an hour or so. The group in red, okay, the group in red they underwent a bout of exercise. So they had their normal amount. Here they were right before exercise. We asked them to fill it out during a bout of exercise, and then for a little while afterwards. Okay? These are non-anxious people. These are not people with an anxiety disorder. What I want you to appreciate is that exercise in and of itself, weirdly enough, makes people more anxious. Okay? A lot of that we think has to do with the fact that during exercise, the exercise changes in heart rate and breathing and blood pressure mimic many of the somatic symptoms of anxiety. So it in some ways sort of tricks your body into thinking it's more anxious when what's really happening is we're just getting these natural exercise things. Okay? So it goes up and then it tends to come back down a little bit after the bout of exercise. Okay? So these people were not really anxious. They were kind of in the low 30s. Okay? Here, not really that particularly anxious. And so they didn't get much of a dip afterwards. However, if we test people that have an anxiety disorder, who have much higher anxiety scores, what we see is that this dip afterwards, they tend to dip down farther below where they were initially with their amount of exercise. Okay? So, if we look at this then, who tends to feel less anxious following an acute bout of exercise? All ages, men and women, novice and regular exercisers. To some extent, people that are low on the anxiety scale, we can argue that this is lower than this, but there's not a lot farther down that they can go. But especially people that are kind of moderate to highly anxious are going to see a fairly significant reduction right after a bout of exercise. Aerobic exercise at almost any intensity will work. Go for a walk, go for a run, go for a sprint, whatever it is. Okay? It can be on the bike, it can be walking, it can be on the elliptical, you name it. Aerobic exercise tends to work regardless of time, regardless of intensity. Okay? Resistance exercise, so lifting weights, also seems to work, but it has a funny time course. Resistance training tends to lower anxiety, but it takes a couple of hours. It's a more delayed response than what we see with walking or running or something like that. Okay? So, you have a test tomorrow and you're anxious, go for a run. You'll immediately feel somewhat better. Okay? If you got a little bit of time on your hands and it doesn't matter that much, then you can lift some weights and you will also feel better, but it may take a little bit of time. Okay? So, here we have the effects not of an acute bout of exercise, but what about chronic exercise training? So, chronically increasing your physical activity. Okay? Here we have, again, some somewhat older data from the late 90s, and we have 3 groups here. And they underwent 10 weeks of exercise training. Okay? They were using this thing called the Hamilton Anxiety Scale, which is just a different questionnaire. But again, higher scores mean more anxious, lower scores less anxious. And what you see here is we had 3 groups. We had a group in the squares that did aerobic exercise 3 times a week for half an hour at like 65% of VO2 max. We had a group in the dotted lines with the circles, a group that took a drug called clomipramine. We used to give our since passed away cat clomipramine. He was a real pain in the ass and wanted to bite everybody. And we think that he was kind of anxious and stuff. But clomipramine is a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. It's an SSRI. It's a commonly prescribed medicine for anxiety. And then the open circles here was a placebo, right? So the people that were getting the clomipramine didn't know if they were getting clomipramine or if they were getting the placebo. So what you can see here is we have these things. The takeaway from this graph, what I hope you guys get is 2 things, okay? 1, medication and exercise both tend to lower your anxiety, okay? And they tend to lower it to a relatively similar extent here over time. Okay? The second thing I want you to appreciate is that look at what happens while I'm getting the placebo. For a month, I feel better, right? I'm less anxious, and then it stops working. This is a highlighting of what we call the placebo effect. You don't know what you're getting, but the fact you're getting something makes you feel better, okay? Very common, very powerful, very much a real thing, but after some period of time, because there's no active ingredients in your placebo, it actually begins to wear off. Okay? So we have anxious people, and we get a similar reduction in anxiety from exercise as we do from taking a drug. Okay? Now, to you guys, this may not seem like that's that big of a deal, but in the late 90s, these are some of the first studies that began to kind of figure out, oh, look, we can really use exercise as a treatment for chronic anxiety. Okay? So now the big questions. How and why does exercise make you less anxious? The honest answer is we don't have a damn clue. Okay? We really don't know. But in some ways, it doesn't matter, right? If you do it, you feel better. That's all that's really, really important. From a clinical standpoint, you will feel better. Now, we think there are probably some physiological and cognitive explanations. People have hypothesized all of these different things, and there is some research evidence both in support of and that can refute all of these things. We baked something called endogenous opioids. You guys have probably heard of things called endorphins, potentially. An endorphin is an endogenous opioid. Your body makes its own morphine, or it makes its own Oxycontin, okay? Now, you exercise and it goes up a little bit. You got to exercise a bunch to get a pretty significant increase in these endogenous opioids. You get much more of an increase in endogenous opioids if, like, Liz was to come up here and let me, like, kick her in the leg repeatedly until I broke her leg. You need a much more kind of significant kind of trauma to get these big increases in endogenous opioids. Okay, so maybe that plays a role, but you don't get a lot of an increase. Plus, we can give you drugs that block these things, and we still see it. Exercise may help to better regulate what we call the monoamines. So these are neurotransmitters. Serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, all of these things are going to change. They tend to go up during exercise. Okay. Is there some re-regulation of those? In some people, yes. Okay. In other people, not so much. Weirdly enough, there's some evidence that exercise, because it raises your core body temperature, it may be the increase in body temp that makes you less anxious. Okay? You guys ever been really anxious? You take like a hot shower, or you get in the bathtub or something and you feel better? Yeah? Or what's the stupid exercise place where they try to cook you while you're in there? One of our master students works there, and they like shine infrared lights on you, and it's like super duper hot. You guys familiar?
Called red effect.
Hot works, okay? So sure, you're gonna get a double whammy there, but raising core body temperature seems to make you less anxious. How and why, we don't fully understand, but it may simply be that the exercise warms you up, and that's good, okay? There's interesting evidence that people that do, that are anxious, that go to group exercise things or have some sort of a goal based upon their exercise that they can then achieve, that social interaction and sense of achievement may be what lowers their anxiety. And a lot of this may depend upon what it is, like about what are you anxious, right? You know, I'm anxious because I have a social phobia or I have something like that, right? And that may be where the social interaction is better, okay? But you just kind of feel better about yourself. That makes you less anxious. And then another one that's also probably really, really prevalent, this is the one that my wife talks about that she thinks is the biggest deal for her, is that exercise, especially somewhat vigorous to quite vigorous exercise, is distracting, right? I've been worried about this stuff. I'm going to go run, or I'm going to go to CrossFit and flip tires over, or whatever else it is that we do at CrossFit, right? And I'm working so hard, I have to focus on that, and so therefore I'm not going to be able to think about or focus on whatever it was that I was worried. It's a way to distract you from whatever it is that you were doing, and that breaks some of that cognitive worry cycle. Okay? So actual improvements may be from some combination of several of these things that are going on. Okay? And in some ways, it doesn't really, really matter, right? As long as it works, that's in many ways really important. Okay. Now let's talk about depression. Okay. So anxiety is more common than depression. And as a person that has a lot of anxiety, I don't want to minimize the negative effects of anxiety. I really don't. Okay. But of the two, depression, even though it's less prevalent, depression is the one that in a lot of ways can be scarier, can lead to kind of worse outcomes than anxiety does very often. Okay? So depression is this prolonged, intense, and overwhelming feelings of sadness and loss of pleasure in previously pleasurable things or activities. Okay? So people that are depressed are very sad. And that's kind of the easiest way to kind of conceptualize it. So, unlike anxiety, depression tends to be a thing that tends to wax and wane, much more so. Okay? And by that I mean that it comes and goes. So about 1 in 3 people, okay, so about a third of all people may be depressed at some point in their lives. And when you see what the definitions or the DSM definitions are, this will hopefully make more sense to you. Okay? So anywhere between maybe 5 and 10% of all people are depressed at any one given time. Economic cost is pretty great. It's about $40 billion or thereabouts. Again, a lot of this from I can't get out of bed, I'm not going to go to work, in addition to sort of therapy and medication and those things. So what I find to be not very great statistics, okay? So if 1 in 3 people may be depressed at some point in their life, okay, only 1 in 3 of my depressed people will ever seek treatment for that depression, okay? And of that third of people that seek treatment, only about a third of them will get treatment that they find to be effective. Okay? So lots of people are depressed. Not very many people actually seek treatment. And the ones that do seek treatment oftentimes do not get a lot better from that treatment. Okay, so that's kind of a big deal that we need to be really focused on. And I'll highlight ourselves back to this when we see the effects of exercise on depression. Okay? So here are the diagnostic criteria. You have to have one of the first 2 symptoms here, and then at least 5 of our remaining 7, basically daily for 2 weeks. Okay? So remember, for anxiety, it's 6 months. Depression is just 2 weeks. And so this is a deal where things are going to come and go much more so, right? Sad mood most of the day, nearly every day, or loss of interest or pleasure in previously enjoyed activities, okay? So think about if this has ever been you, okay? If this has ever been you for just a 2-week period, just 2 weeks, okay? And then that is going to be accompanied by a significant change in appetite or body weight. It doesn't matter if it's up or if it's down, okay? I've lost weight or I've gained it. I'm eating all the time. I'm not eating at all. Insomnia or hypersomnia. So I'm sleeping not at all or I'm sleeping a ton. So change in appetite or body weight regulation, change in sleeping patterns, physical slowing. So I feel lethargic or I'm super agitated. I feel fatigued, okay? I feel worthless, or I have this excessive amount of guilt, okay? I'm not a good person. I have nothing to offer to other people. I have nothing to offer to the world, okay? That's that idea of worthlessness. Very, very powerful and very disconcerting. Difficulty thinking or concentrating, okay? Much like what we have with anxiety. And then the one that is obviously the most dangerous one is these recurrent thoughts of death or suicide, okay? And so these are the things, right? 1 of these first 2 and 5 of these other 7, okay? Nearly every day for a period of 2 weeks, okay? So My guess is that some of you, okay, and I would include myself in all this, have felt this way. So you can say, I have had a bout of depression. Okay? Oftentimes people go through these things when they have lost a close relationship, right? They've lost a loved one, something of those nature, they've had some kind of traumatic experience, right? And in a lot of instances, if you just kind of persevere through it, then it tends to get better, right? It goes away, and maybe you feel better, and maybe it never comes back. But there are some people who are going to be predisposed to being depressed, and they may get and feel these ways even without sort of loss of relationships or things like that, and it may come and go. Okay, you may feel good for a couple of months, and then this comes back, and you're that way for a couple of months, and then it goes away, and it comes back, and it goes away, and it comes back. Okay? So just things to keep in mind. So who tends to get depressed? All right, what are some of our risk factors for becoming depressed? Depression, even more so than anxiety, tends to run in families. So if you have a family member who has dealt with depression, a close relative, right, mother, father, sister, brother, grandmother, those kinds of things, you are likely to be more prone to becoming depressed. A recent loss or major stressful life event, especially this idea of loss. Okay? And when that loss may then deprive you of a close relationship, so I lost someone that I was close to, okay? In a lot of different ways. Or simply I just lack what I feel like are close relationships. And that does not always mean romantic relationships. It may be lack of a close relationship with family, or feeling like I do not have close friends or something like that. Okay? So it does not have to be sort of relationship in the traditional sense of people thinking about like romantic relationships. Interestingly, being female and ages 35 to 45 also tends to be a risk factor. I don't really know why that's going to be the case, but if you look at the data, it tends to be more prevalent in this particular range. And then also if you are a woman who has recently given birth, there's something called postpartum depression, which one of my wife and I's really good friends, she had this really terrible postpartum depression after her daughter was born a couple of years ago. And and so this is not something that is talked about very much, ladies, but it is real, and it is really, really traumatic, where you don't want to have anything to do with your child, you just feel worthless, like nothing's going correctly during this time when you're supposed to be super happy because now you have this little kid. Okay, so these are some of the kind of risk factors that we can think about that may make you more prone to becoming depressed. Okay. So remember that I told you that we don't have a lot of really effective or really good treatments for depression. One of the best ones, though, tends to be exercise. Okay? There's probably been more research done on the effects of acute and chronic exercise on depressive symptoms than the effects of exercise on any other kind of mental illness. Okay? So somewhere north of maybe 1,200 or 1,300 studies over the last 40 years. Okay, we've got cross-sectional studies, we've got prospective studies, we've got exercise training studies, we've got things where we're comparing exercise to other kinds of treatments. And the general take-home is people that are more active are less prone to becoming depressed. If you are depressed, being or changing so that you become more physically active or you exercise more tends to lessen your depressive symptoms, and continuing to be active tends to make you less prone to having your depressive symptoms return or return as intensely at some point in the future. Okay? Of all of the things that we can do for depression, increasing physical activity seems to be about as good a treatment as anything else that is available to us. Okay? So, from cross-sectional and prospective studies, people that are more active tend to be depressed less often. I can take all of you guys in class, figure out who the most active person is, and there's a reasonable chance that those people that are the most active are going to probably have the lowest depressive scores. Okay, we just look in a population in that way. That seems to hold for men and women, older folks and younger folks, okay? And we seem to see reduced incidences from these prospective studies. We follow people from some point forward, especially in older adults who remain active and who take up activity, okay? Some of you are maybe not right now, but maybe relatively soon getting to that age where your grandparents are of an age when either some of them, their spouse, their friends are going to begin to start passing away. In older adults, this is one of the things, is lack of close relationships or loss of a close relationship as people begin to pass away from age really tends to exacerbate these feelings of loneliness and kind of depressive symptoms. And so people that can remain active are going to tend to be in a better place for all of them. Okay? When we do training on people, so we have all of you guys start exercise training, what we don't see kind of a bottoming out in people who are not already depressed. So if you're not depressed or you don't have depressive symptoms, I can train you all I want and you're not going to become less depressed because you're already not depressed. Does that make sense? We call that a floor effect. It can't go down any farther because there's nothing there to begin with. Okay? But people who have somewhat to quite elevated scores, so if you're kind of moderately to severely depressed, exercise training tends to reduce your scores. Okay? And the benefit seems to be similar in both magnitude to what we see with medication. Medications for depression and for anxiety are tricky things, right? I've been on 3 or 4 different medications for my anxiety before we found one and a dose that we thought worked. A lot of those same kind of things are going to happen with depression. It's the same medication, doesn't always work in everybody. Some work better in some people and worse in others, and we don't fully appreciate how all of that works. Okay? This is just showing, right, a depression score. This is on the Beck Depressive Index. People that exercise and then control group, we've got like about 10 weeks of all of this. This is showing here that my exercise group is becoming more fit and their depressive scores are falling, just like our coach groups. Exercise training tends to lower depressive scores. Okay? This is the one that I think is really interesting and fascinating and maybe one of the kind of the key things. Okay? Here we have pre-treatment depressive scores, medication, exercise, combination of both medication and exercise. 1, similar reductions in your depressive symptoms from exercise and your medication, no combined effects of both. Okay? So once we can get you down here, exercise just as good as the meds. But then when we jump to this one, this is going to be, we're taking people that were in the exercise group, the medication group, the combined group. And here's the number of people in our group that recovered, okay, in the black bar, number of people that partially recovered, and then the number of people here, kind of our lighter, kind of dark gray bar, are people that relapsed. So they became depressed again. And what I want you all to look at is exercise got more people to get all the way recovered, and many fewer people relapsed than medication or some combination of the medication. Okay? So the take home is exercise works, and if you can continue to exercise and be active, it seems to be even better than medications at kind of keeping these depressive things away, okay? Keeping them away. So how does it work? Much like with anxiety, we don't really know. We don't know, we don't fully understand, okay? Are there changes in cognition? Maybe, okay? One of the things that tends to be highly associated with depression is this idea of self-esteem or self-efficacy. How do you feel about yourself? Are you a worthwhile person? Do you feel like you can do things and offer things in the world? Exercise really seems to have some positive benefits on both self-esteem and self-efficacy. Okay? These kinds of things tend to be independent. People oftentimes, I have found, think of self-esteem as it relates to physical appearance in some ways. I feel good about myself because of what my weight is, or what my muscles look like, or what clothes I can fit into or wear, or something like that. They think of appearance. Self-esteem is much, much, much more above and beyond all of those things, okay? For many of you guys, how you do as a student, right, in class is going to have impacts on your self-esteem. How you are interacting with your friend group or your family group is going to impact your particular self-esteem. We see that exercise seems to really help from a self-esteem standpoint. It feels like you're accomplishing something. I am worthwhile. I am good. I can do these things. Yes, it may help to re-regulate the monoamines. 5-HT is serotonin, 5-hydroxytyrosine. Serotonin, this is the stuff that's in tryptophan, that's in turkey, helps promote the kind of serotonin, which makes you sleepy. Is there going to be changes in the hypothalamus pituitary axis? Maybe. And then weirdly enough, exercise may also help to regulate or re-regulate your circadian rhythms. Okay, you guys familiar with what circadian rhythms are? Kind of light and dark cycles and how it controls when you sleep and things. So strangely enough, if you look in, I gotta think about this, it's latitude. Latitude are the lines on the globe that run east to west. Latitude's that way, longitude is north and south. People that live at high or low latitudes, so you live in Alaska, you live in Scandinavian countries. Scandinavian countries have like the highest quality of life, the best education system, all of these things. People are happier there than kind of better things there than any place else in the world. And yet they have some of the highest suicide rates because it's dark 6 months of the year, or it's light 6 months of the year. They live at these very high latitudes. That impairs circadian rhythms, okay? Your body is used to this kind of light and dark cycle. When those things get impaired, exercise seems to help return them to a more normal level. When they become impaired, that tends to lead to these depressive symptoms, which is kind of interesting. Okay, so that may also be playing some kind of a role. Okay. All right, so we're going to talk very briefly here at the very end about a couple of things with athletes and lots of activity and its overall effects on mood. Okay. So what I'm showing you here, guys, these are scores from the individual scales on the profile of mood states. Okay. So you can pull up your own scores if you want to and look at these things. These are scores from female Marine recruits prior to and then at various intervals through their basic training. Okay, so imagine what you think Marine recruit basic training looks like. Okay, lots of getting yelled at, probably lots of told him that you suck and you can't do things, lots and lots of physical activity. Okay, so we have them broken down. Here is fatigue, confusion, depression, tension, anger, vigor. Okay, I want you to pay particular attention to the subscales for fatigue and the subscale for vigor. Okay, so look at this. We have week 1 of basic training. I'm super fatigued. By week 12, when I'm doing lots of things, very little fatigue. Okay, look at my vigor or my energy. Right, like it's going to tend to go up over time in response to all of this. Week 1 sucks. I'm angry, I'm depressed, I'm tired, I'm confused, I'm very anxious, okay? This is why I would never do well during basic training. These kinds of things. Very stressful on the psychological systems. All of these things tend to get better and you get more energy as you go through basic training, okay? So what I want you guys to see from this is that being very active can initially cause one thing to happen, and then it can flip it all around, and it can make some other things better. So the reason that we pay attention to fatigue and to vigor is these can be some of the hallmark things that we can use to check whether or not people are becoming overtrained or kind of what is happening with athletes or kind of the general population. Okay? Things that we tend to see. When you exercise a lot, it improves your mood. Okay? Your fatigue levels fall, your vigor levels increase. Very widely observed kind of thing. you're doing more things that might fatigue you, and yet your fatigue levels are going down, your energy is going up. So very positive things. We see this in people that are sedentary. We also see it really, really prominently in clinical conditions like people that have cancer and people that are post like a heart attack. Right? Cancer-related fatigue, you get chemotherapy, you get radiation therapy, you have this unexplained fatigue. Exercise seems to resolve some of it. Okay? Another piece of this, okay, is what happens in athletes. Athletes tend to be people that are active all the time, okay, because they're training. So in general, athletes, either because they are athletes or because they are people that tend to be active a bunch, have a very kind of common set profile when you look at their PALM scores. Okay? What we tend to see is that athletes tend to have a better or more positive mental health than the regular population. So they have less anxiety, less depression, less anger, less fatigue and confusion, and more vigor than kind of controlled non-athlete people. This has been termed something called an iceberg profile. Okay? The reason that it's called an iceberg profile is because of something like this. Okay? What you guys see here, there's a branch of exercise science that is called exercise psychology. So these are people that are psychologists that study sort of how changes in psychological states affects exercise performance, but also then how exercising a bunch affects psychological states. Okay? And sort of the father of all exercise psychology is a guy named Bill Morgan. And what you see here, these are data from runners, wrestlers, and they're calling them oarsmen, but they're rowers. Okay? And these are folks from the late 70s at the University of Wisconsin, because Bill was a faculty member at the University of Wisconsin. Okay? They're crazy. Anybody ever been to Wisconsin in the winter? It is super cold. Okay? I've been to Madison once. I went up there to learn how to use some of our pain testing equipment. It was November. It was snowing. There were people out on the lake near Wisconsin's campus. They were rowing like while it was snowing. I was like, y'all are crazy. But anyway, because I'm a weak Southerner. What you can see here, this is a different form of the PALMs. This is a longer form, so the scores can go all the way up to 80. But what I want you to look at is where the red line is here at about 50. This is average. This is average for the general population. And we have tension, so anxiety, depression, anger, vigor, fatigue, confusion. So when you graph them like this, you will note that our athletes tend to, in general, be below normal, regular normative values in everything. All of our negative states, we tend to be lower. They're kind of about the same with anger, but lower in our negative mood states, higher in vigor. And so we call this the iceberg profile because you see this, and then these are down under the water. Okay? That's where iceberg comes from. So, what we know from all of this, though, okay? What we know is that this is the typical pattern. When I take you, okay, if I took Leah, we're going to assume that this is what Leah's profile looks like, and I say, Leah, it is about to be, we're going to put Leah on the rowing team, and we're going to start training, okay? And she's going to go from doing some kind of normal amount of stuff now that we're really, really going to hit it hard for the next, say, month, okay? As people begin to train harder and harder, we call this overreaching. As you overload more and more, the profile will flip, okay? Vigor falls, and then especially fatigue and depression will increase, okay? And so these are the hallmarks of something that we call overtraining, or in the psychological terms, it's sometimes called staleness, okay? Which I think is kind of a crazy term. What that tells us is you're doing too much, okay? You're doing too much, and what we find is as the profile begins to flip, if we give you a couple of days when you work out and you don't go as hard, or you get a rest day or something, then the profile begins to flip back in the other direction. okay? And so what people have done and what they continue to do is there's a couple of fascinating papers in people that were training for the Olympics, and they used the day-to-day changes in their iceberg profile to alter how intense their workout was on a particular day. And as long as they had the normal-ish iceberg profile, they would have them train hard. When it began to flip, they would give them a rest there. They would give them an easier training day for a couple of days until it went back like this. And what they found was that people that trained in that way versus just, here's what you're doing, I don't care what your profile tells us, here's your training schedule, they ended up doing better by, they called it titrating their training up and down based upon their psychological needs. Okay? People have been looking for a physiological marker of overtraining for 100 years, right? You guys may get a thing, anybody has, like, you may on your Apple Watch or something that may calculate something called heart rate variability. Okay, there's some other ones that do this. They're going to argue that, well, your heart rate variability, which is a measure of sympathetic to parasympathetic input, that may tell us something about how well rested you are today. And if your heart rate variability is good, then you can train harder. If it's not, it's trying to put some physiology behind this. To date, this is more sensitive. This seems to be better than changes in resting heart rate, changes in epinephrine and norepinephrine levels, changes. People thought cortisol was the thing. When you become overtrained and you're too stressed, your cortisol levels go up. Cortisol is just a fucking mess. It fluctuates between meals. It fluctuates day to day. The assays aren't very good. It's a complete mess. We've messed with trying to measure it in a couple of our studies and things. Not very good. This tends to be about as good as anything. Okay? About as good as anything. So there we go. All right. That's what I got. That's it. That is mental health and physical activity. Okay? Many of you are anxious. Many of us have been depressed at various points. If we are more active, that is better. Okay? There we go. That's what I got. Okay. So, what I'm going to do, sometimes if you guys want to know why I'm anxious, it's because of her. So, her little bat outfit for Halloween. So, she is a crazy lady, and I worry that I'm going to make her anxious. Okay. So, we're going to